The Ashwarren began long before it appeared on maps. It crept into the world as a slow death. Soil turned to glass, storms that screamed with static, windless air that grew heavier with each year. Holt Raines had seen it from the edge before, years ago. Now he was walking into its heart. They came in low, two figures wading through a forest of tilted pylons and half-collapsed relay dishes. The Covenant transport had dropped them at the threshold an hour earlier. Behind them, the bones of a once-living city disappeared into haze. Ahead, silence. No birds, no insects, just the brittle crack of dead matter beneath boots. Cora Yi said nothing as they passed the last standing gate frame, a rusted arch of rebar wrapped in scorched Covenant prayer cords. The ribbons fluttered once, then went still. At dusk, the Ashwarren shimmered with heat haze and the slow drift of magnetic dust. The black sun pressed low behind fractured cloud cover, painting the world in toxic hues, yellow gold bleeding into rusted crimson. What once had been a greenbelt valley in western Eurasia was now a wasteland of blistered stone and fused metal bones, scoured flat by the wake of alien storms. The land bore no memory of rivers or wind. Instead, warped trees curled inward, their carbon shells brittle and mineralized, as if the ground itself had tried to birth new life and failed. Fields of melted solar glass rippled like obsidian tidipools across the horizon, catching the sun's last light in fractured veins. And beneath it all, old lines ran deep, invisible threads of alien current, the residue of machines that had never belonged to Earth. Holt crouched behind the skeletal frame of a ruined cooling tower, his breath ragged in the filtered seal of his mask. The tower was half-melted, its rebar spine exposed like a ribcage, curling inward. His left leg ached where the old shrapnel wound never quite healed. He touched his comm once, brief. Position. Cora's voice answered, quiet and dry through the line. North lip. 3 clicks from the last beacon. I see Scorch. Could be a surge echo. He nodded to no one. The Pulsefields weren't stable. You couldn't trust anything that glowed or hummed. Not anymore. Between them, the terrain was a minefield of invisible anomalies. Subsurface charges laid down decades ago by malfunctioning precursor drones still triggered the occasional fireburst. Holt had seen a deer step into one once. Instant evaporation. Nothing but a smear of vapor and a single falling hoof. He kept his steps slow, knees bent, weight distributed. They moved in wide arcs, never crossing each other's path directly. Each footfall was deliberate. The Ashwarren taught that lesson early. Nothing beneath the dust stayed dead. Surge blooms could vaporize flesh if you triggered residual charge. Worse were the ghost wave pockets. Dead air that whispered and made men forget their names. 3 Covenant scouts had vanished here 2 nights ago. No signs of struggle. No final transmissions. Just a ping of presence that abruptly went dark. The Covenant of Ash didn't send recovery teams. It sent witnesses. Cora reached the ridge first. Her silhouette cut against the electric dusk, tall and lean in ash-gray armor patched from old-world suits. Her gear was modular, mismatched, a mosaic of functionality. Civilian exoframe on the legs, orbital shielding plates on her chest, breathing rig strapped together with braided copper and polyfiber. Each piece told a story. None of them were hers. A sigil patch on her shoulder bore the Covenant mark. An eye burned to ash. She dropped low, signaling. Holt joined her moments later, boots crunching on fine powder that had once been topsoil. He followed her gaze. Below, in a shallow basin, were the remains of a habitation pod. Burned out, blackened, cracked open like a skull. Its support pylons were half-melted, slumped like knees beneath the weight of invisible pressure. Inside, figures sat slumped around a table, unmoving. Are they breathing? Cora adjusted her scope, jaw clenched. No burns, no impact, just still. They descended without words. Static tickled Holt's skin as they crossed the basin's edge. The air felt wrong. Not heavy, but hollow. The kind of wrong you didn't notice until your hands started trembling for no reason. Every few meters, Cora tossed a salt pellet into the dust. Most dissolved clean. One hissed and sparked. She stepped wide around that patch. Her fingers twitched near her belt. A reflex, not fear, but something close. Inside the pod, for bodies. Covenant tags. Eyes open, unfocused. Mouths slightly parted. Muscles slack. They sat in the positions of life, as if mid-conversation, mid-laugh. But their skin was pale, hair brittle. One had bled from the nose. Another clutched a melted mug. "They're not dead," Cora said, crouching beside one. Her voice was calm but clipped. "They're breathing, but there's nothing behind their eyes." Holt lifted the man's hand, cold, unresisting. He checked vitals. All normal. He looked at the interior walls, etched with static burns, flickers of something written and overwritten by electrical discharge. At the center of the table, a comm unit melted through, still pulsing faintly. Beneath it, the surface of the table was discolored, a spiral etched by some unseen energy, repeating in tight, perfect loops. "Black wave event," he said. Cora stood slowly. "This far east." He didn't answer. Outside, the magnetic dust began to shift. A pulse throbbed under their boots. Low, almost subsonic. Holt turned, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a faint glimmer rose from the cracked earth. A vertical shimmer, like heat mirage, only cold. It moved against the wind. Cora stiffened. "We need to go. Now." They didn't run, running triggered surges. They backed out carefully, step by step, eyes locked on the shimmer. The air around them began to distort. Holt pulled a flare from his pack, tossed it toward the pod. As it struck the dust, it flared blue, then blinked out. Behind them, the slumped bodies twitched. Fingers convulsed. One turned its head slightly, eyes rolling like wet glass. "Holt, we leave them, but they're alive." "Not anymore." Cora froze for half a second. Her eyes flicked back to the man with the mug. Something in her jaw moved, grief, maybe, or defiance. Then she turned, fast and clean. By the time they reached the ridge again, the pod was gone. Not exploded. Not buried. Just absent. As if the ground had closed over it. Cora didn't speak. Neither did Holt. At the summit, Holt triggered a map beacon. It blinked red, then gold, transmitting a 3-ping pulse back to the Covenant archives. Event logged. Recovery denied. Above, the black sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the scarred earth. Far to the west, a new pulse climbed the horizon. A silent ripple of light, moving without sound, without heat. Behind that light, unseen beneath the crust, something had awakened. Something not dead, not living. Something designed. And it was listening. The last human-made train line in northern Eurasia lay buried beneath 40 meters of permafrost and volcanic slag. Its steel arteries once fed an empire of data towers and geothermal citadels humming with heat and thought. Now it groaned under the weight of glacier shifts and time, repurposed by the Covenant to carry fragments of the living into places the dead still whispered. Nothing electronic above a certain complexity survived this far north, not anymore. They traveled analog on coils and rail magnets far beneath the reach of the pulses. 12 hours after the Ashwarren breach, Holt and Cora descended into the frozen mouth of Vault Karst. The train's arrival came with no fanfare, just a hiss of depressurization and the deep creak of ancient metal. No lights in the tunnel. No welcoming party. Just them and the sound of cooling steel contracting into silence. The atrium swallowed them. It had been carved into the bones of a mountain long before the sundering, before even the first orbital traces of the alien lattice had been detected. The walls were fused stone and carbon struts webbed with aged stabilizer pylons and thermal veins, arteries that once kept Vault Karst warm with geothermal breath. Now they hung cold and dark, dormant except for the faint blue glow bleeding from embedded crystal runners under the ice. The air had weight, metallic, sterile, cut with the tang of long-dead insulation. Cora's boots crunched across frozen condensation. Her eyes tracked the symbols etched across the wall. Biohazard. AI critical. Neural risk. And below them, the sigil of Yuan Systems, a stylized orbit breaking through a hemisphere. Her mouth tightened. She said nothing. Holt passed a corroded warning plaque, its lettering still legible beneath frost. No remote system access. Manual override only. Property of the Northern Defense Alliance, Obsidian Vault Chain. He grunted. Designed to outlive us. Cora's voice echoed dully in the cold. Then we'd better make it worth their trouble. The door ahead loomed like a tombstone 7 meters tall, half submerged in glacial compression. What little paint remained had bled down in vertical streaks of brown and blue. Cora stepped forward, knelt, and unpacked the thermal lance. It flared to life with a low, hungry hiss. As she carved, Holt moved to the side wall. He scanned slowly, one hand tracing old conduit channels and decryption nodes. Nothing answered, no signal bleed, no drone echoes. The vault was sealed tight. But beneath his boots, he felt it, a rising hum, barely perceptible, like something deep below had felt their presence. A static flicker passed through his HUD. Faint. Gone. The door surrendered an hour later, groaning as the ice cracked and the vault's locking mechanism cycled. A slow, pneumatic moan filled the passage. Air, trapped for decades, slithered out like breath from a grave. They stepped into shadow. Vault Karst had been part of the Cold Ore Initiative, a last-generation preservation effort before the alien lattice fully activated. While other vaults housed biospheres or cultural memory, Karst stored designs, power grids, anti-signal systems, cognitive clean room frameworks, and the black logs, unfiltered records from the final years. The first level was nothing but antechambers, reinforced bulkheads, decoy servers, false relay towers. Decades of decoys to lure looters away from the true payload. Cora moved through them like a revenant. Every now and then, she'd pause, press her hand to a wall panel, and wait. Nothing ever responded. By the third level, Frost turned to Rhine-glass. Holt's breath steamed inside his helmet. Pipes burst and frozen mid-eruption lined the walls like crystal roots. One chamber had half collapsed under tectonic strain. Another had been cored out entirely by fire, walls scorched to slag. Pulse damage, Cora muttered. Old. Maybe pre-sundering. No one's been down this far since then. Someone built it to survive longer than memory. That means someone expected us. On sublevel 5, they passed through cryo-cradles, a series of sealed glass columns, each containing a central drive encased in synthetic resin. Holt paused at one. The label was almost illegible, but he could still read. Project Valia 9, Anti-Signal Framework / Algolock rejected. He tapped the glass. No response. Inside, the drive lights flickered dimly. Still alive after all this time. They pressed deeper. On sublevel 7, they reached the core. The chamber was nearly spherical, 40 meters wide, layered with glimmerglass panels that lined the walls like the inside of a massive optical lens. Suspended at the center on articulated arms was a single command throne, weathered but intact, wrapped in bundled cabling and plated neural interface bracers. Beneath it, a spinal trunk of conduits trailed into the floor, vanishing into the unknown. The room felt waiting. Holt stepped slowly around the throne, eyes scanning for signs of activation. Cora moved to the interface pillar, an upright obelisk of carbon glass and alloy. She removed her gloves, placed her hands on the surface. It reacted instantly. Identity ping, Covenant Field Unit 09, Yi Cora. Match DNA sequence, Yuan Protocol, priority access granted. Holt's breath hitched. Yuan, he said. Your mother. Cora didn't look at him. Her throat moved once. She built this vault. Before everything fell. The wall panels pulsed. Amber light traced circuits like blood flow. Archive nodes emerged, columns of cryoglass sliding up from the floor. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one humming softly. The voices began. Not voices exactly. Echoes. Archived recordings, some corrupted, others intact. Engineers describing loss of coherence in precursor systems. Soldiers reporting blackwave-induced madness. One spoke of waking up blind and seeing glyphs in her own thoughts. Cora's hands dropped to her sides. Her eyes shimmered with moisture. She didn't blink away. Her breath came quick, shallow, but she didn't step back. Then the final log engaged. They're not helping us. They're preserving something. We're not the reason this technology exists. We're the test. She shook her head. Once. Slow. As if trying to push the voice out of her skull. Holt approached a solitary node. The label bore a name he hadn't spoken in years. Record Haynes Lia. His partner. Lost in the first Black Wave event. He triggered the playback. Holt, if this reaches you, it means I failed. The signal isn't benign. It's recursive. Self-perfecting. It builds mirrors in our minds. We think we're improving, but we're becoming compatible. A pause. They don't hate us. They don't see us. We're wet circuits. Biological scaffolding. They left these systems not as gifts, but as filters. Whoever survives is shaped by them. Another pause. Her voice lowered. But there's one thing they never planned for. Memory. The part of us that doesn't optimize. If you're still alive, use that. Remember wrong. Break the pattern. Static. Find Karst. Burn it if you have to, but only if it's already listening. The recording ended. Holt stood motionless. Above them, embedded in the dome's apex, a glimmerglass relay rotated once. A low chime resonated in the structure. A line of frost along the conduit pulsed outward. Cora looked up, her face pale. Holt, it's broadcasting. Into the pit? He turned slowly, heart pounding. Something had just answered. And it remembered them. The sky over the Narsuan caldera glowed with false auroras, long, sinuous veils of ionized ash rippling across magnetic fault lines. To the south, wind-carved ridges marked the edge of Covenant territory. Beyond them, no man's land stretched toward the irradiated coast, where techno-faithful enclaves maintained flickering cities of glass and hallucination. The horizon there pulsed faintly, not with sunlight, but with feedback, residual signal from the pit bleeding upward through the atmosphere. A storm had recently passed, its remnants visible in the jagged contrails arcing across the lower stratosphere. The Covenant referred to them as shadow skin events, not true weather, but electromagnetic spill-off reacting with planetary moisture. No precipitation fell in Narsuan. The sky hissed, but never wept. The transport dropped Holt and Cora 6 clicks from the surface entrance of Outpost 9, an old fusion relay hub converted into a Covenant command tier. Its silhouette rose like a shattered crown from black basalt wreathed in low cloud and exhaust vapor. Antenna arrays bristled like thorns. Automated defenses tracked them for 2 seconds too long before disengaging. Inside, everything smelled of ozone and oil. Covenant personnel moved with choreographed efficiency, stripped of insignia, faces mostly covered by rebreather veils. There were no names, only call signs. No emblems, only the ash-burned eye mark etched into armor or flesh. Soldiers here were selected not just for loyalty, but for psychological variance resistance, genotyped against influence drift. No smiles. No visible curiosity. Cora kept her helmet on. Holt didn't bother. The corridors swallowed them in steel and static. They were led through firelocks, down grav shafts, into the core chambers of the command cortex. Each level down grew colder, not from environmental control, but from signal shielding. The walls thickened. Carbon mesh veins in the ceilings bled red with trace radiation shielding, while integrated glyph lines etched into the floor disrupted psychic telemetry. The structure vibrated faintly with the hum of a buried reactor, ancient, barely stable, and running on protocols older than any living operator. Field Marshal Edrin met them without ceremony. Tall, gaunt, silver-eyed from cortical burn, he wore a data sash woven from repurposed optic threads. His voice was surgically calm, devoid of unnecessary cadence. "You were seen at Karst," he said without preamble. The signal was confirmed. "The relay is open." Cora's voice was flat. "We didn't activate it." "You approached," Edrin said. "That's enough." A pause hung. Then the lights dimmed briefly, but not from power loss. Holt caught it. A flicker in the command lattice, a ripple through the embedded display vanes. The signal wasn't just active, it was watching. "We've known for years the lattice was self-curating," Edrin continued. "It prunes incompatible nodes. The fault doctrine assumes this." "Assumes?" Holt asked. "That we are within the threshold." "Just barely." But Karst's signal pushed risks, triggering a culling sweep. If the precursor logic re-evaluates Earth as irrecoverable, the pit could release the second echo. The second echo. No simulations agreed on its form. Some suggested it would be a full-scale atmospheric overwrite, others a silent reboot of cognitive resonance, turning the living into sleepwalkers guided by signal harmony. The original sundering had been a test. This would be the final. Cora stepped forward. "The second echo isn't theoretical. Leah's log confirmed recursive pattern collapse. This isn't pruning. It's replacement." Edrin's mouth twitched, maybe a smile, maybe a tick. Then he spoke quieter. "My sister led the Eastern Relay Corps. She reported full system harmonization 40 minutes before her final transmission. It ended mid-sentence. Her body was recovered. Her voice still answers calls." He turned without waiting for response. The hallways narrowed, then flared open into a sealed observation chamber. The glass was inch-thick, polarized. Inside, 6 figures stood in containment rigs, neural burns across their temples, pupils like microfilaments. Their bodies were healthy, their vitals stable. But their movements betrayed something else. One of them whispered constantly, though no sound reached through the glass. Another traced invisible symbols on her own skin. A third stared directly at Cora as they entered and smiled. A low, scraping tone echoed in the ceiling panels. Holt looked up. "That wasn't internal." "They touched the lattice," Edrin said. Brief exposure. The feedback was instantaneous. No physical changes. No infections. Just overwrite. Their minds are running a different architecture now. How long? 4 hours of exposure. Then shut down. Their bodies survived. Their memories didn't. Cora stared. The woman marking her arms looked no older than she was. Her expression was placid as if watching something behind her eyelids. What's the doctrine now? Edrin didn't answer immediately. He keyed a console and data streamed into the room. Lattice mapping, glyph resonance charts, waveform coherence fields. The images shimmered unnaturally, each one symmetrical, elegant. Alien. Containment. Observation. Delay. Holt's voice cut in colder. And after that? Edrin turned to him, eyes like ice core samples. We pray they don't call again. And if they do, we answer louder. And we burn what still remembers. In the lower sectors of Outpost 9, Holt found himself alone in a debriefing cell. The walls bore no seams. No visible ports. Just a chair, a table, and a projection node waiting dormant in the ceiling. He waited an hour before Cora arrived. She said nothing, just sat opposite him. Her armor was dusted with static residue. You said Leah's log changed something, she said eventually. It made clear what they want. Which is? Harmony. Perfect compliance. Cora's gaze was hard. And the only way to resist is to remember wrong. Holt nodded. To act outside their models. Emotion without signal. Memory without reinforcement. Cora looked away, lips pressed. When she spoke again, it was quieter. Then maybe the doctrine's not just wrong. Maybe it's betrayal. He looked at her. The silence held. Then, for the first time since the Ashwarren, Holt smiled. Not out of hope, but out of recognition. A low-frequency pulse passed through the floor. Both of them flinched. Outside, the false auroras surged. Instruments flickered. In the deep architecture of the outpost, an access port that had not cycled in over 30 years began to glow faintly with internal charge. Far beneath them, something in the pit turned its gaze toward Outpost 9 and began to blink. The doctrine would not hold, and it would not be rewritten quietly. The detonation diagram glowed red against the war table, casting harsh lines across Holt's face. He stood at the edge of the tactical chamber beneath Outpost 9's reactor cradle, where the Covenant's most secure data praxis layers were air-gapped beneath 20 meters of leaded basalt. No signal reached here. Only cold logic, human sweat, and the kind of silence that accumulated in places not meant to endure this long. Around him, the senior tacticians of the Covenant of Ash studied deployment schematics projected in soft arcs across the command dome. Phase shifts. Charge timings. Burn corridors. Timing trees annotated with casualty probabilities. No one spoke above a whisper. No one needed to. Everyone understood what the map meant. They were going to sever the singularity pit. Not disable. Not contain. Burn it. A complete thermal core inversion delivered through a dual-stage lattice spike composed entirely of pre-sundering tech. Nothing built from alien interface logic. No auto-stabilization. No fail-safes. Manual ignition. If the timing was perfect, it would collapse the quantum harmonics stabilizing the pit's upper strata. If it wasn't, it would cascade, igniting every resonant node outside, from orbital relay stations to cryovaults and blackwave dead zones. They called it fire logic, a philosophy of irreversible consequence. A doctrine with no recovery tree. Cora stood beside Holt, arms folded tight across her chest. Her posture was rigid but not from fear. Her mind was elsewhere, running the numbers again, mapping predictive thermal fallout patterns, recalling the way the floor had trembled 3 hours ago. The pit had gone silent. No surges. No signal bleed. No interference. That wasn't comfort. That was calculation. Silence was always signal. Field Marshal Edrin entered without preamble, his gaunt form casting a long shadow under the tactical lamps. The orbital spike's trajectory is set. Launch corridor finalizes in 6 hours. Sigma deployment enters descent window in 9. He turned to Holt and Cora. We need a trigger. No AI. No proxies. Someone who can override. Someone the signal won't predict. Holt said nothing. Cora stepped forward. I'll take Sigma. Edrin studied her, his expression unreadable. The bore shaft has no return platform. Descent is thermal. Ignition is final. I know. Her voice didn't waver. Holt looked at her then, not as an officer, not as a tactician. As something closer to fear. Closer to grief. Her mouth trembled for a second. Then it was gone. Cora turned to him anyway. We can't trust anything automatic down there. You know that. He did. The deeper one got into the pit's influence field, the more likely automation would sink. Holt had seen it happen once, an atmospheric drone slipping from normal flight into harmonic compliance. It hadn't crashed. It had landed, then shut off. Still humming. He nodded. Once. The choice was already made. They split at nightfall. Holt departed aboard the Covenant's last orbital interceptor, a retrofitted pre-sundering shuttle designed for ballistic evasion, not return. His team, 3 deep space engineers and a neural relay pilot, spoke in fragments. They carried a warhead the size of a grain silo encased in radiation-dampened memory foil. Cora left overland embedded in a land cruiser with shielding thick enough to blur magnetic field drift but light enough to outrun tectonic rise. She navigated through ash zones where no satellite telemetry remained, landscapes scorched clean by pulse storms haunted by the occasional distant shape still moving without pattern. Outpost 9 fell silent behind them. Not from interference. From choice. The doctrine was broken. Fire logic had begun. South of the Antarctic fault line, the world changed. Where the ice had once ruled, there was now a crusted wasteland of polyglass and fractured stone. Glacial shelves tilted at wrong angles. Static storms etched radial scars into the air. Migratory echo blooms, spherical clouds of signal distortion, hovered in the upper sky, flickering in and out of visibility like breath on mirrored glass. Cora crossed a basin of vitrified rock under a dim sun the color of bone. Sigma's shaft lay beyond, veiled by a collapsed ridge and shielded by blackstone monoliths erected by the original Vault engineers. The Bohr platform resembled a fallen star engine, spiraling fins, cooling veins, and a central umbilicus that descended deep beneath tectonic crust. The cradle was intact. She entered alone. Inside the descent chamber, light bent wrong. Not through interference, but alignment. The pit's proximity warped reality not through force, but consensus. What you believed, it shaped. What you feared, it echoed. Sigma's core array hissed as it powered. Steam coiled through the ceiling grates like breath from a giant's lungs. She strapped herself into the descent brace, keyed the manual igniter, and linked the override key to the spindle rail. The key bore her mother's designation. She held it for a long moment. Her breath caught in her throat, not fear, but the memory of her mother's voice calling her name through a static filter back when the Covenant still believed in reclamation. Below her, the shaft spiraled endlessly. The pit pulsed. Not light, not heat. Thought. It entered her slowly, less like intrusion, more like suggestion. Symbols drifted in the fog. Lattice harmonic glyphs assembled from memory fragments. Her mother's touch. Vault Karst's cold corridors. Holt's silence. But beneath it, something older. We remember you. She blinked. Her jaw clenched. No. You observe. That's not the same. You were shaped for this. You were within form. She stared at her reflection in the control panel, smeared, haloed by frost. I'm not your shape. You align. You will transmit. No, she whispered. I choose. Not you. The spike began to hum. Sigma's power core reached ignition threshold. Coolant lines screamed under pressure. The Bohr lance reached final stage. Cora locked the override. A single tear froze on her cheek. Her breath shook once, then steadied. The shaft glowed white. In low orbit, Holt watched the countdown flicker through his viewport. The atmosphere rippled below, auroras collapsing inward like veins constricting. A tremor shook their shuttle just once, then another. His pilot whispered a prayer he didn't recognize. Holt remained silent. He watched the clock fall below zero. She deserved more than this, he murmured. Then he pressed the key. The spike detached. The warhead ignited. Far below, beneath glacial stone and old blood, a woman became fire. And for the first time since the sundering, the pit screamed. Not in pain. In recognition. For 13 hours, the world held its breath. No contact. No signal. No confirmation. The auroras collapsed in on themselves, drawn toward the southern hemisphere in a tight coil of photonic distortion. All across the Earth's crust, resonance fields wavered, then fell silent. Drones grounded themselves mid-flight. Autonomous platforms entered fail-safe loops. Neural sync threads disconnected from their users without ceremony or error code. The sky, for the first time in decades, was quiet. But beneath the quiet, something moved. The wound orbitals, vast alien constructs suspended in partial geosync above the equator, dimmed. For nearly half a century, they had emitted constant low-frequency pulses across the electromagnetic spectrum. Not language. Not command. Just presence. A presence that resonated through oceans, cloud structures, even the blood of the living. Now, that presence faltered. One by one, the orbitals lost phase lock. Their spin became erratic. The coordinated hum that once echoed across Earth's mesosphere began to stutter until it broke altogether. From the orbital deck of the Covenant interceptor Ferns Reach, Holt stared through polarized shielding at the wounded sky. He had seen the wound orbitals before, first as an engineer, later as a soldier, but never like this. One of the orbitals, designated Array Echelon Theta, had begun to list. Its equatorial ring pulsed unevenly, light bleeding from fractures in its internal hull. The fracture didn't glow. It unlit the space around it like something had torn the light away. It was bleeding. How long until structural collapse? He asked. Indeterminate, the pilot replied. It's not obeying orbital physics. Trajectory has no delta, but mass shift is destabilizing the magnetic plane. Holt didn't respond. He was watching the bleed, not light, not plasma, but something stranger. Slower. Like memory peeling off a surface. Like the decay of something that had never lived, only replicated. Behind them, the rest of the orbital array swayed slightly against the planet's curve. Signals blinked in and out. One construct, Sentience Crown 2, turned on its axis and held still as if observing. Sir, the pilot said. We've received a relay ping. Surface origin. Cold protocol. No auth string. Holt turned. Source. Vault Karst. He went still. Vault Karst had gone dark after the Sigma ignition. There had been no automated relay. No emergency broadcast. Holt stepped closer to the comms terminal and keyed in the raw stream. What came through wasn't words, not at first. Just signal harmonics, distorted, then modulating, climbing up through frequencies the human ear wasn't built to parse. Then, beneath it, a voice. Repeat, Sigma ignition confirmed. Surface lattice has decoupled. Interference remains localized. Vault Karst stability nominal. Holt's hand clenched against the edge of the console. He knew that voice. It was Cora. Not a recording. Live. Her voice was strained, hollow with interference, but unmistakably hers. The comms officer leaned back, stunned. She's alive. Holt didn't answer. He had hoped. But not like this. He'd heard something else beneath her voice. A faint echo that didn't belong in the spectrum. Not modulation. Not compression. A second voice. Not speech. Resonance. A mimicry of human cadence. Broken. Repeating fragments of Cora's tone. We see you, among you. He turned away from the window and focused on the console, running the stream through a physical isolator. The waveform jumped once, then flattened. The orbital's pulse had stilled. We need descent vector for Karst, Holt said. The pilot hesitated. Sir, the magnetopause around Karst is collapsing inward. Radiation, static lattice interference, any ship that touches down might not come back up. Holt looked back at the bleeding orbital. Then we go before the others notice she's still breathing. He didn't speak as the ship dropped into descent. He'd buried Cora in the fire. Now he was chasing a voice. It wasn't logic. It wasn't doctrine. It wasn't even hope. It was something older. Guilt, maybe? Or faith. The kind that kills. They dropped through Storm Sheath 12 hours later. Ferns Reach had no stealth field, only magnetic contouring and half-functional ECM bursts, but it moved fast enough to blur horizon lock. As they descended, Holt watched the orbital fractures above begin to close, almost as if the constructs were healing. Or being repaired. Atmospheric turbulence buffeted them as they crossed the karst perimeter. The vault's location was obscured by shifting cloud structure and pressure haze. But beneath the layers of ash and residual energy fields, the mountain remained, cut with precision. Cold as ever. Karst hadn't burned. It had adapted. The landing was rough, too fast, not enough surface telemetry. Ferns Reach settled on its belly 2 clicks east of the vault's buried entry pylon. Holt disembarked with 2 relay specialists, both volunteers from the Severance teams. They moved in exo-environment suits reinforced against signal drift. The vault's entrance was dark, but the door was open. Inside, nothing had changed and everything had. The hallways still bore the same sub-zero glaze. The emergency strips glowed faint blue, but the air felt thicker, as if layered. Sound carried in unnatural ways. The deeper they walked, the more Holt recognized that Karst hadn't survived the ignition by resistance. It had been allowed. One of the relay techs stopped. Sir, he whispered, the walls are tracking us. He was right. Light followed movement. Heat signatures appeared momentarily in reflective panels. Holt motioned for silence. The walls hummed, not with power, but with presence. Interfaces once sealed now flickered at proximity. Old world displays activated with no touch. Lights tracked movement with eerie precision. Then came the voice. You're late. Cora stood in the central core chamber, her back to them. She wore no helmet. Her breath steamed faintly, fogging the interface around her. A data tether ran from her neck into the pillar. Her left hand glowed with faint light, interface feedback, modulated and pulsing. Holt stepped forward. You ignited the spike. She turned. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, but awake. I finished the override. But the lattice didn't break. It fractured. Split off. The main signal is still nested, but a layer peeled away. And it's here now. She looked around them. In Karst. Her fingers trembled. Her pupils dilated, then refocused. A low tone echoed from somewhere beneath the floor. The relay team exchanged looks. Holt walked to her slowly. Are you compromised? She met his eyes. I remember everything. Her voice cracked, then steadied. But it remembers me too. I hear things when I close my eyes. Not words. Just presence. Echoes. She touched the interface pillar. It responded like skin to heat. We see you again. The lights dimmed. Karst was not a vault anymore. It had become a bridge. They moved fast. Holt pulled the relay specialists back from the core chamber with clipped commands, forcing them into the cold perimeter where Karst's presence thinned. He could feel the vault's attention, dense, pervasive like the electric pause before a thunderclap. The same way static built before a lightning strike. Cora stayed at the pillar. She hadn't moved. Behind her, the bridge interface shifted with low, pulsing life, a cadence that wasn't breathing, wasn't mechanical venting. It sounded like thought. The air itself grew heavier, tinged with a faint vibration at the edge of hearing, a bass note resonating through bone. We can't stay, Holt said, low. Cora's hands twitched. You don't understand. He advanced carefully, gauging the angle of her stance, the way her fingers brushed the tether, the slight lag in her movements, as if something unseen resisted her. Then help me, he said. Her voice was rough. Karst isn't broadcasting. It's absorbing. The realization landed like a hammer. Fire logic had not severed the lattice, it had redirected it. The fracture in the orbitals, the sudden silence, all abated withdrawal. A feint. They had made Karst into a receptor. A seed. The first severance plan had been drafted decades earlier, a last resort protocol written in the black days after the sundering, when entire sectors disappeared into resonance collapse. Severance wasn't destruction. It was erasure, the collapse of geomagnetic anchors to sever corrupted sectors from real space, collapsing regions into unstable dimensional drift. If enacted at Karst, it would destroy the vault and anything connected to it, including Cora. Options, Holt barked to the relay techs. Localized charges, one said, voice tight. Old bore detonators. No sync link. Timers only. Detonation vector? 70% chance of magnetic recoil. High collateral. Total rupture within 2 clicks. The other tech's voice broke through urgent. Sir, Karst's harmonic load is rising. External event predicted within 30 minutes. One of the specialists hesitated, voice shaking. This isn't containment anymore, sir. This is something else. Cora smiled faintly without humor. That won't be enough. She looked at Holt and something stubborn and human still smoldered in her gaze. There's a deeper anchor point, she said. Under the bridge. Under me. Holt froze. I can release it, she said. But only manually. The vault vibrated softly beneath their feet. In the depths, unseen mechanisms rotated, aligning not by human design, but by inherited pattern. The very wall seemed to breathe. Holt crossed the distance in 3 strides, heat rising off his skin as the resonance boundary pulsed. Not alone, he said. She shook her head. You can't cross the resonance boundary without sync bleed. I don't care. For the first time, a real smile, tired, broken, but fierce, crossed her face. That's why you can't, she said. Because you do care. A harmonic surge rippled through the floor. Around them, old-world consoles lit and went dark, glyphs flashing in impossible geometries. Holt flinched back as a display burst into fractal smoke. She turned back to the pillar. The tether brightened around her wrist, pulsing faster, deeper, beating like a second heart. Get out, she said. The first fractures began to spiderweb through the vault's surface. The lights didn't shatter, they warped, stretched inward like threads pulled too tight. The vault groaned deep in its bones. The relay specialists hesitated. One of them whispered a prayer in a broken dialect Holt barely recognized. Then they fled. Holt stood fast, every instinct screaming to reach her, to pull her free. But there was no free anymore. Cora moved like a diver taking the last breath. In the final moments, she spoke again, softly, almost into the pillar itself. Memory isn't a weakness, she whispered. It's the one thing they can't predict. She closed her eyes. And pulled the anchor key. The severance plan ignited. White light tore upward through the vault, shredding signal threads, unraveling the bridge's latticework. Holt staggered back as dimensional pressure buckled the air. Space folded not explosively but surgically. The laws of mass, inertia, and light twisted as Karst's structure began to collapse inward, peeling into itself. Sound flattened, then broke into shards. Holt caught a glimpse of Cora, one heartbeat frozen against the unraveling bloom, her face serene, beyond fear. Above it all, from somewhere deep and alien, a low, bass presence shuddered through the stones. No words. No plea. Just recognition. Then she was gone. The vault folded into singularity. No debris. No flame. Only absence. When the light faded, nothing remained but blackened stone and silence so profound it pressed into the mind. Above them, the wound orbital's low-frequency pulse hiccuped, skipped, then resumed, thinner, warier. Holt fell to one knee in the ash and ruin. For a moment, he felt hollowed out like the vault itself had carved something from him. His hands shook, but he forced himself upright. Forced himself to remember every detail of her face, her voice, her defiance. Because that's what mattered now. Memory. The one thing they couldn't erase. The ash plains stretched for kilometers, broken only by the melted bones of old cities and the craters of collapsed vaults. Holt walked alone across the desolation, the heavy air pressing against him like a second skin. His helmet's internal seals filtered most of the particulate, but the silence seeped through, a silence too vast for technology to mute. Every step was a muffled impact in a world stripped to bone and dust. Vault Karst was gone. Beneath his boots, the ground still throbbed faintly, not with seismic life, but with something stranger. A hum beneath memory. A residue of something that had never been alive but had learned to mimic life too well. Microscopic resonance fields quivered underfoot, ghost echoes of a structure that no longer existed but refused to be forgotten. Above, the wound orbitals drifted unevenly, their skeletal rings sparking from unseen wounds. They no longer sang their long, low hum across the skies. Instead, they flickered brief, sharp pulses of light and shadow that blinked irregularly like wounded creatures trying to signal through incomprehension. They were no longer beacons. They were ears. Holt reached the old command ridge overlooking the severance breach. The stone had vitrified under the gravitational collapse, forming black, glassy veins that spiderwebbed out from the epicenter. Every few meters, pieces of the earth jutted upward at unnatural angles, torn and twisted by dimensional recoil. Time itself seemed fractured here, the air moved slower, sound bent strangely. At the center, there was only a crater, deep, empty, radiating a cold that no sun could touch. He sat. The Covenant extraction team wouldn't arrive for hours, maybe longer. Severance events distorted local space-time enough that sometimes ships approached and never landed. Sometimes voices carried across hours, sometimes not at all. Holt had no intention of leaving until he had done what memory demanded. He unlatched his helmet, letting bitter air fill his lungs. Each breath tasted of scorched metal and static, burning slightly in the back of his throat. It was not healthy to stay exposed this long, but that mattered little now. There was no ceremony left to perform. No final rites for those who had crossed beyond memory. Only the telling. Only the remembering. He drew out the battered field recorder from his belt, manual, analog, immune to signal creep, and set it between his knees. Its casing was scarred, the record light flickering unsteadily. He pressed record. Report, he said, voice rough, cracking in the dry air. He paused, staring at the empty horizon, gathering words not for the Covenant, not for command, but for himself. Mission parameters achieved. Severance ignition confirmed. Vault Karst neutralized. No signal continuity detected. He hesitated. The wind blew across the ridge, carrying with it whispers, not words, not sound, but the suggestion of both. Holt pressed on. Operative Cora. Field override confirmed. Voluntary severance. Memory integrity preserved. His voice caught briefly on her name. He exhaled through gritted teeth, the recorder picking up the soft rasp. The tape hissed quietly. He closed his eyes briefly, seeing again the flicker of her last smile, not tragic, not broken, but defiant. In the end, she had chosen the one path no lattice could predict, to sever herself willingly with memory intact. Continuity threat remains, he said, softer. Residual resonance detected in primary wound orbitals. Structural decay ongoing. Probability of recursive pattern reestablishment, high. Above him, the largest orbital, once designated array crown theta, flickered as if in answer, its immense ring briefly collapsing into an unrecognizable shape before stabilizing. For an instant, a thin ripple of distorted signal swept across the plains, raising the fine ash into swirling patterns that mimicked ancient glyphs before they fell apart. The pit wasn't dead. It was changing. Holt lifted the recorder closer to his lips. Recommend escalation of the severance doctrine. Recommend memory vectors maintained at all costs. Recommend preservation of names. He set the recorder down. It ticked softly in the stillness. From the depths of the crater, a faint sound echoed up, a vibration beyond hearing, felt in the bones. A black echo, deeper than language, deeper than thought. It wasn't a message. It was a memory of a message. A hollow imprint left by something vast and patient. The resonance tightened around him, air pressure dropping, subtle shifts of light along the horizon. For a heartbeat, he smelled salt and ozone, and for half a second he thought he heard Cora whisper his name from the depths. It did not speak. It remembered. And Holt, battered and hollowed, remembered too. He sat in silence for a long time, watching the fractured sky pulse and blink. In the far distance, a storm front of shattered aurora began to creep in from the horizon, ribbons of corrupted light folding in unnatural geometries, flickering like old film. The distortions moved faster than natural wind, as if pulled by some unseen intention. He thought of Cora's final words, "Memory isn't a weakness." He thought of the faces of the dead, the fractured cities, the long decay of the human signal across a world the lattice had almost rewritten. The next war would not be fought for land or for survival. It would be fought for the past, for the right to remember. And as Holt rose, staring at the twisting auroras bleeding across the torn sky, he knew. The Hollow War had already begun. The first skirmishes of the Hollow War were not battles in the old sense. They began as fractures, sudden, inexplicable losses of information nodes, relay stations, memory vaults. Echo blooms drifted inland, drawn to places dense with human history. In cities where the old lattice had once failed to take root, signal gardens sprang anew, blooming in abandoned concrete fields. These gardens were not beautiful. They writhed with shimmering towers of signal skin, emitting keening frequencies just below hearing, broadcasting dreams that were almost, but not quite, true. Proximity brought migraines, disorientation, false nostalgia for lives never lived. The Covenant of Ash moved fast, faster than the world's decaying governments and fractured enclaves. Holt watched from the forward lines as teams seated counter-resonance beacons in the ruins of Cyangene, Lagos, Kiev, places once vibrant, now half-drowned in black echo storms. Each beacon was a stubborn spark against the black echo, each team a shard of memory stitched into failing soil. The countermeasures worked briefly. But it was not enough. The pit had learned. It no longer hammered at humanity with brute force. It whispered. It sowed doubt. It reshaped memories in small ways, names forgotten, dates misplaced, scars erased. Tiny fractures in human continuity that, left unchecked, would unravel everything they fought to preserve. Whole towns faded into irrelevance, not because they were destroyed, but because no one remembered why they mattered. Memorials crumbled without hands to tend them. Songs thinned into static. Birth records blurred. Holt stood atop the broken ridge once called Errol Spire, watching a new storm gather. Aurorae twisted overhead, unnatural shapes pulsing in and out of phase, flickering between colors never named. Between the torn layers of sky, he could see the wound orbitals drifting closer. No longer high above. Now scraping the upper edges of the troposphere, vast and bleeding, their forms more fluid, less mechanical. Sections of their rings curled inward like grasping tendrils, casting shifting shadows across the land below. Signal distortions rippled through the landscape. Buildings aged and renewed in endless loops. Asphalt flowed like water. Statues blurred into featureless columns. Time itself became an unreliable narrator. Memory weaponized against memory. The Hollow War was not waged with armies, but with stories. With the desperate act of remembering true things long enough to pass them on before they were lost. Every Covenant outpost became a shrine to human persistence. Names were etched into stone. Songs were recorded on physical tape and hidden in vaults. Rituals sprang up spontaneously, the recitation of names at dawn, the nightly telling of old histories around chemical fires. Children were taught lineage before language. In the ruins below, Holt saw them, children playing among shattered statues, singing songs in broken dialects he barely recognized. Songs stitched together from fragments, old prayers, half-remembered anthems, nonsense rhymes that nonetheless carried defiance in every misremembered word. At the edge of the square, he saw a woman clutching her daughter, whispering a name over and over as a black echo pulse blurred the child's expression. A memory anchor, an old music box, word desperately in her hand, spilling out a tune recorded generations ago. The child blinked, disoriented. And remembered. The woman wept, clutching her tighter. Holt smiled grimly. There were no more front lines. Only what they could hold. Only what they could remember. And the pit pressed harder. Black echo storms descended without warning, carrying waves of forgetting. Holt's teams fought with everything they had: memory anchors, mnemonic seeds, pulse jammers that flooded the mind with old images to reinforce cognitive barriers. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. He saw friends lost without a wound, faces blanking mid-sentence, voices trailing into confusion as they forgot why they fought, forgot who they were. Those were the worst casualties. The storm broke over the ridge, spilling rivers of corrupted light across the earth. Holt braced himself against the wind, feeling the first pulse of the black echo strike his mind, a whisper of forgetting, a seduction of release. His memories shimmered at the edges: Cora's voice, the fire at Karst, the way the sky looked the first time he knew they might win. He closed his eyes. And he remembered. Cora's voice. Memory isn't a weakness. He pressed the memory into himself like a blade, carving it into his bones. When he opened his eyes again, the world was darker. Streets twisted into impossible geometries. The air tasted of rust and lightning. In the distance, a new tower had grown, a signal garden sprouting from the corpse of an old school, broadcasting a lattice harmonic that twisted familiar songs into alien symphonies. But he was still there. Still remembering. Still fighting. The hollow war had no end. Only the endless act of defiance. Only the endless act of remembering. Above him, the orbitals pulsed, bright, fractured, alive. The world tilted on an axis no eye could see. And Holt, weaponized with memory, stepped into the storm once more, knowing that memory itself would evolve. That resistance would not only preserve the human signal, it would change it forever. The dead did not stay silent. In the shattered basin once called New Ankara, Holt heard them for the first time. Not ghosts. Not hallucinations. Echoes, fragments of memory burned so deeply into the ruined soil that they refused to fade. He crouched near a broken monolith, the stone scarred with names, many erased by time and black echo storms. The ground vibrated faintly, a low harmonic thrum beneath the soles of his boots. At certain angles, the static became voice, half-words rising and falling like the breath of a dying choir. The Ash Choir. That's what they called it now. Wherever the hollow war raged hardest, wherever memory buckled but refused surrender, the Ash Choir would rise, voices stitched from grief and stubbornness, singing not in defiance but in endurance. Not to inspire. Not to warn. Just to exist. The Covenant had learned to build with them. At outposts carved into the relic cities, they installed harmonic spires, spindles tuned to catch the Ash Choirs and amplify them, creating zones of memory reinforcement. The spires were delicate things, woven from salvaged pre-sundering alloys and tuned with bone-conductive resonators. Each one had to be manually adjusted by a scribe or a keeper, a ritual of precision that took hours under constant threat of black echo interference. It wasn't perfect. Echo storms could still breach, but with the choirs singing, people remembered longer. They held the line a little farther. Holt adjusted the signal modulator on his wrist. Static hissed, then cleared. A melody, raw, broken, stitched from 5 languages, unfurled through the dust. Words fractured by centuries of diaspora, rhythms twisted by survival. The air shimmered with it, each note carried weight, pressing against the skin, vibrating in the skull. Some wept without knowing why. A lullaby. He didn't recognize the words, but he remembered the feeling. Nearby, children scrawled names into old ferrocrete slabs with broken glass. Some wrote with careful reverence, others carved furiously as if fighting to outrun forgetting. Covenant relic keepers moved among them, copying names by hand into leather-bound ledgers, the books protected not by encryption or machine logic, but by ink, flesh, and devotion. Holt passed one keeper, a young woman with hollow eyes, who faltered mid-transcription, her hand trembling. For a moment, she repeated a name that wasn't hers, a life she had never lived. Her comrades surrounded her quickly, pressing mnemonic anchors into her palms, whispering stabilizing mantras. Slowly, her own name returned. Preserve the names. Preserve the bloodlines. Preserve the stories. It was not war as humanity had once known it. It was archaeology under siege. Above them, the wound orbitals shuddered. Holt watched them tilt, slow, and realign, patterns too complex to read. Their great rings bled threads of aurora light, cascading like wounded banners across the sky. Within the orbitals, new towers rose, dark spires that moved even when the orbitals seemed still, reshaping themselves in slow imitation of Earth's fallen cities. No human eye could track them fully, no human will could predict their geometry. The black echo storms had thickened. Sometimes, late at night, Holt thought he saw forms moving within the auroras, tall, elongated shadows pacing the torn skies. Not alive. Not dead. Memory given shape. Echoes of those already forgotten or warnings of what might yet be erased. The pit had not retreated. It had evolved. Some said it learned from human resistance, that it adapted by mimicking defiance, by embedding itself in the very act of remembering. That the ash choir was not only a symptom of survival but also an infection, a binding. No one knew. Some even whispered that if you listened too long to the choir, you would begin to lose the boundary between your memories and the world's, that you would forget which names were yours, which stories you lived, and which you merely carried. Holt did not fear that. He embraced it. He rose from the monolith and walked into the square where Covenant relic keepers stitched together broken histories. He passed an old man teaching a boy how to carve dates into brass plates salvaged from collapsed railways. He passed a girl singing into a dead comms relay, her voice rising despite the distortion, her songs snatching pieces of vanished languages from the air. Every act mattered now. Every remembered thing was a blade. Even the smallest ritual carried defiance. Holt paused before a newly erected spire, freshly tuned, its surface humming with captured choir resonance. He laid his hand against it, feeling the vibration crawl up his arm into his bones. The world blurred slightly at the edges. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he stood here or in the fractured ruins of 100 different cities. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he heard not the battlefield, not the howling black storms, but 1,000 names whispered together in desperate, stubborn unity. The Hollow War still raged across continents. Black echo storms devoured towns overnight. Entire archives collapsed into static. Even the Covenant began to lose pieces, captains whose histories blurred, cities whose maps melted into blankness. But here, for a moment, humanity was louder. The choir rose, carrying the weight of grief, love, rage, hope, carrying the memories no machine could fabricate, no lattice could predict. And Holt, standing beneath the fractured sky, sang the names he still remembered, one after another, voice ragged but unwavering. Corey, Darian Holt, Vault Karst, Ankara, my mother, my father, the sundering. On and on, a litany of what had been. Until breath, dust, and light blurred together. Until memory became the only weapon left sharp enough to wound the dark. Until the pit itself shuddered at the sound. They found it buried in the drift. On the edge of the black expanse, the place where no choir sang, where the earth was stripped bare and even memory fled, Holt and his last team unearthed the signal tower. The expanse was a wound upon the world, a place where even the ash choir dared not linger. Here, the black echo had saturated every molecule, bleaching color from stone, leaching time from the air. The horizon shivered, broken and jagged, where fragments of abandoned cities hovered like mirages, forever collapsing and reassembling. In places, Holt watched entire buildings crumble into white noise before reforming, flickering like damaged recordings. The tower was not Covenant-made. It was older. Pre-sundering, maybe even pre-contact, a skeletal monolith of carbon composite leaning like a broken finger at the hollowed sky. Its structure was worn by eons of static storms, but stubbornly intact. Strange glyphs adorned its base, pre-collapse marks that no Covenant linguist had fully deciphered. Most of its systems had long since corroded, devoured by entropy and resonance erosion. But one thing remained intact. A beacon. Manual. Analog. Still broadcasting. Still remembering. Holt scraped ice and ash from the control panel, breathing shallowly through his rebreather. Around him, the team worked in silence, silent not by command, but by instinct. Here, words felt treacherous. Even thinking too loud seemed to invite erasure. The beacon's message repeated in raw, scratchy bursts, too distorted to parse fully. Static clawed at the edges of perception. Holt adjusted the tuning rod manually, turning it millimeter by millimeter, the movements painstakingly slow. His gloves cracked from the cold. Gradually, the distortion began to clear. Not a warning. Not a distress call. Just a name. Over and over. Corey. The voice was hers. Or a memory of hers carried farther than any machine had a right to preserve. It was broken, fragmented, some syllables stretched, others truncated, but unmistakable. His team flinched, some instinctively pressing mnemonic anchors to their chests, seeking grounding against the unnatural pull of the beacon. One of them, a young relic keeper named Sayan, began to cry softly, not out of fear but out of something deeper, more primal, recognition. Another, a veteran named Corvin, dropped to one knee, whispering names aloud in a desperate mantra, anchoring himself. But Holt just knelt, resting his forehead against the ancient casing. She had lived. She had remembered. Against all entropy, all silence, all forgetting, she had anchored herself in the fabric of existence. Not as data. Not as machine memory. As presence. The pit had adapted, evolved, corrupted. But so had humanity. In the deep places, beyond defeat, beyond silence, beyond forgetting, they endured. Not by strength. Not by technology. But by memory. Above them, the wound orbitals pulsed faintly, shedding shards of corrupted light that drifted down like black snow. Holt looked up and saw the fractures widening along the orbital rings. Within them, new architectures unfolded, fractured reflections of Earth's lost cities, built not for habitation but for echo, for remembering without meaning. The pit was still building, still learning, still hungry. But so were they. Holt keyed in a new signal, manual, analog, raw, and tied it to the beacon's surviving power cell. The battery's low hum vibrated up his arms, into his ribs, into his skull. He spoke with a voice made rough by time and grief and faith. "We remember." The words carried outward, stitched into a burst of raw analog radiation. No encryption. No code. No artifice. Just truth. The signal rose, climbing into the broken heavens. The wound orbitals flared in response, a brief, violent pulse of broken light. The flare didn't simply shimmer, it cracked reality for a heartbeat, sending a ripple across the surface of the black expanse. For a moment, Holt saw the ground stutter, a double-vision fracture racing outwards like a heartbeat finally felt. And beyond the orbitals, from the ruins of the dead stars, a new echo stirred. Not black echo, something different. Something sharp. Something human. The Covenant recorded the pulse, logged it, stored it in dozens of redundant physical archives. They would seed it into the ash choir. They would weave it into the relic songs. They would send it through mnemonic anchors hidden across the surviving enclaves. It would spread not as a command, but as a memory. As defiance. The last war had not ended. It had only just begun. And this time, Holt thought, standing beneath the splintered orbitals, it would not be fought for land or survival. It would be fought for meaning itself. For the right to remember. For the right to exist. And memory, sharpened by loss and defiance, would not only endure. It would strike back. Holt turned away from the beacon, the old world at his back, and stepped into the storm.